first step we have to do is recognize the problem. There's a lot of veterans out there coaching each other about how to be as sick as they can. And I think it's deeply dysfunctional. I think it's bad for society. It's bad for veterans. It's bad for the perception of veterans. It's bad for our national security. It's bad for our public finance. I mean, it's a horrible problem. And so somebody has to blow the whistle on it. And I'm glad that you guys have the courage to have somebody like me on, because you'll get hated.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another week of Mops and No's here with Drew and Alex. Alex, today we got a good one. I think it's going to trigger a few people, start some hopefully lively debate. We have Dan Gade. Dan is an Army veteran who became an amputee in 2005 while serving as a company commander in Ramadi, Iraq. That did not stop his Army career. Dan retired from the United States Army as a lieutenant colonel in 2017 and went on to work as a disability and veteran services activist, a professor, and a researcher. He currently serves as the commissioner of the Virginia Department of Veteran Services. Dan has a bachelor's in environmental science from West Point and a master's in public administration and PhD in public policy from the University of Georgia. And Dan served in the administration of President George W. Bush, taught at both West Point and American University, and was appointed to the National Council on Disability. And probably most notably for this episode, he is the author of Wounding Warriors: How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. And as a fun additional note, he became the Paralympic world champion at the 2010 Ironman 70.3. So yeah, needless to say, Dan has done a lot of things, and he's advocated for a lot of interesting initiatives within, especially like you mentioned, Veterans Affairs. And one of the reasons why I think initially we were driven to his book, or one of the reasons why I was driven to his book initially, is because within embedded human performance, obviously the idea is that we are increasing lethality, increasing readiness, effectively doing all the things, regardless of whatever branch you're in, doing all the things to make a more resilient warfighter. And it's interesting to see how something like that competes against a system, which is what Dan talks about, that is quite literally financially driven disability. This idea that you can increase your rate, and an increased rate brings additional financial incentives. And he dives into that in great detail in his book, but we also go into quite a bit of detail here in our conversation with him this week.
And I'm going to put all sorts of stuff in the show notes in terms of recommended articles that he mentions during this episode. So if you want to dive into some reading, you can check those out. And certainly check out the book. It's a great read. It's got a ton of citations in it. It's heavily researched. You'll find a lot of kind of inside stuff on how things work behind the scenes at the VA. And I guess kind of a theme here to get you thinking about it is look at the incentives the system puts in place, not necessarily what leaders say they want to come out of something. And there are a lot of cash incentives to be broken and to be disabled. And I haven't seen a whole lot of really powerful incentives to be healthy in the long run. And that's something we'll dive into here. It's a challenge. This is a topic that gets a lot of people fired up. I'm confident that I will get some constructive, hopefully, criticism once this thing goes live. Looking forward to all that.
Well, I think, yeah, we talked about this with Dan too, because I think at the surface, his biggest critics go after what they believe to be an attack on disabled veterans, which is not by any means what Dan is trying to do. He'll say it himself. I think Dan thinks that the VA is kind of a fantastic organization. I would challenge people who get a little bit triggered by this conversation to actually read his stuff, like read his book, listen to some of the other podcasts he's been on, read some of the writings that he's done for various publications, because I think that it's really hard to come up with a counter argument against some of the things that he is trying to improve within the VA system. So I just thought it was interesting. I think we asked him, what has been the biggest critique of your work? And he says a lot of people will say things without having even read any of it. So don't be that person.
And I'll tie this into current events a little bit. There's been some talk about this recently. There was a congressional budget office, not even proposal, just discussion of various strategies towards balancing the budget a few months back. And the way both veterans and veteran service organizations responded to that was pretty violent, frankly. Not a lot of like reading into it or discussion of it, just like a massive, like, you must hate America, you must hate veterans if you even want to have a conversation about this. And Dan addresses it right up front in the book, and he's certainly aware of it. This topic is a third rail in politics. It goes nowhere when you try to have any kind of conversation about it, because it's really easy to tear someone down for hating veterans. And as we all know here, there's not a lot of room for nuance in public discourse lately. So this one gets pretty heated pretty fast.
All right, without further ado, enjoy. I do want to ask you kind of a softball, maybe a softball to start, but what made you want to write this book in the first place? Like, what was your calling to go after this?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess people would have to really sort of understand what my life story is, but basically, I'll give you the short version. So after I graduated from West Point, I did regular Army stuff for a couple of years, and then by 2004, I was a company commander in Iraq. I commanded a company in Korea for a year and a half, and then after that, I went to Iraq, and we could talk about this part later, but I was wounded in action twice. First time by a rocket-propelled grenade, which hit my tank and killed my loader, the guy next to me. His name was Dennis Miller from LaSalle, Michigan. And as a side note, I just think it's really important to say their names, you know? So Dennis Miller gave his life that day, and I was wounded mildly in the first incident. And then 2 months later, I was hit by a IED roadside bomb that injured me critically. And I ended up in the hospital at Walter Reed for about 6 months as an inpatient and another 5 or so months as an outpatient. And during that time, I was exposed to, I'll say, a lot of, there were a lot of other women, right? We'd do social events together. We'd hang out. At the time, there were these steak dinners that guys would go to and stuff like that. So I noticed there was like bifurcation or a departure of intention, I would say, between two different kind of groups of people. There were the groups of people who were desperate to get better and either get back to the Army, get back to their jobs, go back to Iraq or Afghanistan. There were those people. And then there were the people who were in the mode of, they were definitely going to get out. And then they were like, what am I going to do when I get out and stuff like that. And there were all these groups that would go around and they would go sort of door to door in the hospital, or they would go door to door in the Fisher House, or they would be there handing out their flyers. And their purpose was to basically help people sign up for disability benefits, right? So DAV would show up, Disabled American Veterans would show up, and they would say, hey, you got to make sure you get to 100%, we'll help you get to 100% and 100% disability, And then there were these other groups. Wounded Warrior Project was around at the time; it was brand new, and all these people were like helping. They were essentially helping guys label themselves as totally broken and disabled. And I had this really important, I kind of a critical turning point experience in my life where my wife came to me really early after I was conscious, because I was unconscious for like 3 weeks. She came to me really early on when I was conscious and said, hey, look, Daniel, while you're sick, I'm going to take care of everything. I'll do our taxes. I'll take care of our kid. I'll, on and on and on. But when you get better, it's your job to take care of our family. You're the man of the house. You're the one who's going to provide for us. I will do it because I have to. You're doing it. You're going to do it as soon as you can, as soon as you're better, because it's your duty. And, that sort of tough love, tough talk, real talk, right, was critical to me seeing myself as like redefining my purpose as taking care of my family and being the man that I used to be, despite the amputation and all the other stuff that I had going on. Whereas these other guys, their new purpose was becoming as disabled as they could. And so I filed that away in my head. And I thought, man, how gross. Like, what is this system? I don't understand it. And so I stayed in the Army, went to get a master's degree in public administration and policy, started doing research on the VA. And then at the end of my time in my master's program, I got selected to go to the White House and do veterans policy at the White House. So I went from like user level user level experience in veteran stuff starting in January of 05. And then by July of 07, 2.5 years later, I'm at the White House doing veterans policy for the White House, So I went from user level to the very highest possible level of veteran stuff. But I saw the same thing at the very highest level. These organizations were trying to get as many veterans onto the disability dole as they possibly could. And I was like, man, how gross, what's going on here? And so as I began to look into the system, I just saw all these red flags. And we're obviously going to talk about the red flags, but I saw all these red flags and I was like, somebody has to tell the truth here. We have to tell the truth about what the system is doing to people. And for me to be the truth teller, with 2 Purple Hearts, a PhD in policy, and only 1 leg, I feel like I'm in a pretty good position to be taken seriously on these issues. And so I felt like if nobody else was going to tell the truth, then at least I had to.
So we'll dig into the red flags like you talked about in a second. But before we do, I guess a 2-part question. Part 1 is the obvious question, which is what was the response like when the book came out? But while you answer that, I'm kind of wondering, did most of the response come from people who actually read the book and thought through it and talked to you about it? Or did it come from people who figured out what the general thesis of the book was and reacted immediately?
It's such a great question. So I'd done quite a lot of writing and, thinking and so forth on these issues. I'd had a couple of op-eds published in the Wall Street Journal. I'd had a above the fold New York Times story about some stuff I was doing that was pretty clear that I was really critical of the disability system. And that was January 7th of 2015. If you want to go look it up, it's pretty cool. Like if you're above the fold of the New York Times, either you did something kind of cool or you're doing something pretty horrible. In my case, it was kind of cool. But I was teaching at West Point at the time. And so my email address was easy to find. You could just go to my department's website and find my email address. And when the New York Times story came out, I got probably 100 emails over the next, let's say, 2.5 days related to the story that had come out. And I thought that it was going to run like 90-10, sort of 90% screw you and 10% like, yay, go you. And actually it ran the opposite. It ran like 90%, hey, you're doing the right thing, and 10%, you're the worst thing ever. And what was funny about it was virtually everybody who said that I was doing the right thing, it was almost like they had cut and pasted. They hadn't, of course, but it was almost like they had cut and pasted their comments, because it was like, yeah, you're so courageous for saying this. Everybody knows this is true, but you're the only one who's ever heard say it out loud. It's that kind of stuff, that kind of, it was the direction they went. And so I was like, wait a second, this is really interesting. So then over the next, couple of years, the book was published in fall of 2021. It's about 1.5 years ago. By the way, the book is called Wounding Warriors, How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. Everybody should look at it. Here's a cover image. Oh, my filter is getting rid of it. There we go. My filter looks pretty good. Anyway, so the book is called Wounding Warriors. It's on Amazon. I did the audio book myself. But so the result, the reception was broadly positive. I mean, the cover blurb was written by General Mattis. I've had a couple of former secretaries of Veterans and Affairs that are cited in the book, or that Medal of Honor recipients that wrote book blurbs for me, and all of them were like, "Holy cow, this is so courageous and such a great book." And so there were some doubters and some sort of haters out there that kind of, and if you go on Amazon, you can see the sort of reviews, and you can easily tell which people read it and hated it, which people read it and loved it, and then which people didn't read it and hated it. You can tell. But what I would say about the people who really hate it is, I use a phrase all the time, and that's if you throw a stone into a pack of dogs, the one that yelps is the one that got hit. And so the people who, and I'm not encouraging throwing stones at packs of dogs, by the way. And I don't remember the last time I even saw a pack of dogs. But anyway, so the one that yelps is the one that got hit. And so one of the critiques, one of the guys who criticized me on the Amazon reviews is this guy, and I looked him up, and he's some kind of lawyer who was only ever a lawyer in the military, but he's 100% disabled because of some, sort of nonsense stuff. And it's like, oh, okay. So that's why this book that's why you didn't like the book, is because it sort of calls out your nonsense. And so that's been kind of my experience here, is that there are people who are really invested in seeing themselves as broken and disabled. Like that's their identity. And so if you critique that system even gently, then they lose their minds and come after you. And so that's kind of been my experience with the reception.
Talk about this in the book. Obviously, you spend a lot of time talking about it, but the purpose of veteran disability, because legally, the rating schemes are all to compensate people on lost earning potential. But then, like you just mentioned, it's also sort of a label of suffering or a recognition of suffering. And my question, or rather my comment, I guess, is this is something that was created around, 1917 timeframe, World War I timeframe, and we're thinking of jobs that are mostly manual. They require you to have, certain limbs, certainly. But now it's shifted. We're dealing with a society that is way more technologically advanced. So what is the purpose of veteran disability now?
Yeah. What a super question. So you're right. I mean, the system grew from 1917, 1918, especially. There had been previous efforts to do this sort of thing. So after the Revolutionary War, there was a Revolutionary War pension thing that people advocated for that eventually became law. And then during the Civil War, around the Indian War times of the sort of 1870s, Civil War previous to that, there were some disability things, but it was in some cases it was literally like you got paid by roughly the weight of the body parts that you had lost. So if you lose a hand, the hand is pretty light. If you lose a leg is more heavy. And it's like, so there were some really early clumsy ways of trying to do this. But ultimately, what Congress settled on was a system that, as you said, is designed to compensate for the average loss of earnings. The way it's phrased is the average loss of earnings incurred by somebody with that condition, I'll say. So the rating schedule hasn't been updated in any serious way for decades. And so that means that there's a bunch of stuff in there that modern medicine, modern science has basically made into non-disabling conditions. There's just they're conditions that are potentially even serious conditions, but that are not disabling conditions. And so what is the purpose of the system? Well, the purpose of the system is morphed. If you're building a coral reef, you build it like layer by layer. The way this has been built is layer by layer. So it was initially this good purpose of compensating people for earnings lost due to their service-connected disabilities. And now it has become a way for politicians to virtue signal about how much they love veterans by adding and adding and adding. And so the coral reef gets bigger and bigger. And so the most recent addition was something called the PACT Act, which is the Plan to Address Comprehensive Toxins. That's what it stands for PACT. And that it's bad public policy. It's terrible public policy. It's the burn pit legislation that you've heard of. Oh, yeah. And here's why it's bad public policy, because it has a bunch of stuff in there that's just completely nonsensical from a medical point of view, but from a political point of view, it makes total sense. So, for example, veterans have, after you adjust for age and sex and race, veterans have the same exact rates of high blood pressure as anybody else does. Again, adjusting for the normal things you adjust for. But in the VA system, if you ever set boots on the ground in Vietnam, over the air in Vietnam, or in the waters off Vietnam, and a couple other places, and you're presumed to be exposed to Agent Orange, and so if you have high blood pressure, you are presumed to have high blood pressure related to that Agent Orange. But that's completely nonsense. It's so nonsense, because these people have the same rates of high blood pressure as anybody else, and so high blood pressure is it's age related, but it's also a lifestyle condition. And so the VA system is full of these like lifestyle conditions that are rated as if you're some combat wounded warrior guy. And it's a nonsensical way of looking at it. And it has some really pernicious negative effects where it changes people's behavior, it changes their identity, it changes how they see themselves. I mean, really, really destructive in a lot of ways. And that's just built up over time, and it's political pressure that causes it, because the the interest groups, the DAV and the VFW and the American Legion and Woodward Project and all those that you've heard of and some that you haven't, all of those, their ideal veteran is one who like comes out of a VA clinic sort of crying because he can't get the benefits he wants. And then they put their arm around him and say, oh, come on, veteran, we got your back, for the low price of whatever annual membership, we'll totally help you, get to 100% as if that's a laudable, worthwhile goal. And it's simply not.
So this is a little bit more of a comment than a question, but I think there's a danger here in terms of like how people hear the stuff we're talking about. And it can sound like it's an attack on individuals for like what they have done and how they have done it and what they've received or what they haven't and those things like that. And I think there's some nuance here in terms of like individuals for the most part are just responding to the system that has been built around them. They're responding to incentives, and cash incentives are powerful incentives. So I think making sure the conversation stays focused on addressing that system rather than blaming people for the way they respond to that system. And that's something that seems to get lost.
Yeah, for sure. And that's an absolutely awesome point, Alex, because the subtitle of the book is how bad policy is making veterans sicker and poorer, not how veterans are making themselves sicker and poorer, or how veterans are fleecing the American taxpayer, anything like that, because that's not my critique. My critique is that through political pressure, we have designed a system which, although it purports to have positive effects for veterans, in reality is changing their behavior and making them worse off. And all the veteran is doing, with the exception, and I can talk about some exceptions, but what most veterans are doing is just exactly as you said, Alex, which is responding to the incentives that are placed in front of them. And then the results are predictable from that. Now, there are some bad actors. There are definitely some bad actors. There's this famous case in Texas in a place called Dripping Springs outside of Austin, where this dude got a free house from a nonprofit because he claimed to be paralyzed from like the chest down. There's all these super sad interviews with him in a wheelchair and his wife with his arm around him, poor veteran kind of thing. And some investigative reporter was like, wait a second. I went to his house and took like long range video of him walking around, totally non-disabled, unloading lumber from the back of a jacked up pickup truck into his garage. So you're talking about this guy doing real physical manual labor while claiming through the VA that he was upset, or that he was paralyzed. Another case was this really funny one where a guy had filed for 100% disability, and I don't remember what the condition was, but it had something to do with his legs. And he claimed that he couldn't walk and he couldn't do anything, and poor me, But somebody found some videos of him on like Instagram or something, and he was a competitive bodybuilder. So here you've got this guy with some kind of leg condition that makes him 100% disabled, and he's like squatting 500 pounds and doing all this stuff. And it's like, okay, well, hang on a second. You are truly a terrible person if you're doing that. But in most cases, the way that this actually happens is a veteran is sitting, as they're getting ready to leave military service, a future veteran, a service member is sitting in front of the VA claims person, because everybody kind of has to go through that system. And the claims person says, hey, I found all these disabilities for you and I can get you to 100%, I think. And the veteran's like, hell yeah, let's go. Well, nobody ever tells them the other side, which is that by getting to 100%, or by doing that, by putting yourself through that effort, what you're doing is you're decreasing your propensity to work, you're decreasing the amount of hours you spend at work, you're poisoning everybody else's perception of you, because now instead of seeing you as positive, vital, mission-oriented, others oriented, they see you as a broken toy. And that changes people's propensity to wed. It changes their how their child rearing goes. So much negative effect, but the system isn't designed to be negative. It just happens to have become negative because of the political formation of how it happened.
I want to sneak in like a brief nerdy social scientist comment here. There's a quote from Steven Pinker in the book Better Angels of Our Nature that humans tend to judge the likelihood of something happening based on the ease of recalling examples. So we don't really respond to data, we respond to evocative examples. So I think, like you said, on the bad side of this, people picture the fraudsters who are just lying to get money. And on the good side of it, people picture combat wounded veterans that went through some horrible traumatic incident. And the reality is a little bit more bland and a little bit more typical. And it's just veterans going through the transition assistance program process and getting nudged in the direction of putting a couple extra things on the paperwork, and a claims adjuster moving them a little bit towards a higher percentage and things like that. It's not these like outlandish cases. It's the people responding to incentives in totally normal ways. And I think keeping that in mind, it's the same. I get frustrated because the gun control debate is always about mass shootings, but mass shootings aren't the real problem when it comes to guns. And this isn't going to become a podcast about gun control, but people get fired up about like the memorable big incidents, when the things that are killing us and the things that are hurting us are the unsexy, not on the front page of the news, not on CNN. They're the everyday examples of slightly worse or slightly better.
Yeah, I think that's completely correct. Yeah, I think that's right.
I want to ask you this because you touched on it a little bit there with your last answer, and you mentioned some of the research in the book, just the idea of systems that have like the warping effect of the financial gain aspect on psychiatric disorders, medical conditions, and how that relates specifically to the VA. Just this idea of essentially disability for gain. Like, what does that research look like? Because it's one of those, and we see this all the time in human performance, where it's like a piece of research will come out that seems exceedingly obvious. Like we had a guy on who showed that, if you increase exercise, it's good for mental health. And you receive that and you wonder, why is this not just commonplace knowledge? And the same thing was going through my head reading your book, because it's like, obviously a system that rewards, well, quote unquote, rewards you for being disabled is going to run into these fail points. So where is the friction between what the research is saying and what the policy keeps moving forward with?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that in two separate ways, because the question sort of seemed like it changed kind of midstream. So
That's fair. I do that sometimes.
Yeah, no. Listen, we all do it. So you asked what the research was and how it actually plays out in real life. Here's how it plays out in real life. So there's some real great PTSD research about when people are applying for disability benefits related to PTSD. What does that look like? Well, their treatment-seeking behavior is excellent during the time when they're 0%, 10%, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% disabled for PTSD. Their treatment-seeking behavior is excellent. They go to their clinics, they take their medicine, they go to the group, all that stuff. But once they get to 100% disabled, which you would think would mean that they need the most treatment, and so they should be seeking the most treatment, their treatment drops off dramatically. The amount of treatment they seek drops off dramatically. And that leaves you with essentially like one conclusion. Why are these people dropping off? Well, they're dropping off because they got to their goal, which was 100% disability. And so the question of whether or not they're truly recovered from that condition, which, by the way, PTSD is totally recoverable from, and there's lots of research about that among rape survivors and other kinds of war trauma and things like that. But PTSD is recoverable, but these people are not recovering. Instead, they're getting to the worst possible state, 100% disabled, and then they're staying there forever, and they stop going to treatment and everything, at least in part because they're afraid they're going to lose their benefit. They're afraid they're going to lose the cash, and they'd rather be sick with $4,000 a month in their bank account than well with potentially a smaller amount of money in their bank account. So that's the kind of general research. There's another piece of research that's relatively recent that showed that if you are doing clinical trials on PTSD recovery, so maybe you're doing some kind of ayahuasca trials, or maybe you're doing rapid eye movement therapy, or maybe you're doing various kinds of, I don't know, maybe you're doing hyperbaric oxygen or something, but you're doing studies on how to get people to recover from PTSD. What the study showed is that veterans make a very, very, very poor study group, explicitly because the amount of money that we pay them to stay sick distorts their behavior in a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially it's like doing a cancer study on somebody who's still smoking. It's really negative. So that's kind of that's the answer to the first half of your question. The second half was more about like, how do we get here? How do we get where this is the case? And the way we got here is a couple of different ways. One is the political thing I talked about earlier. Every member of Congress, every senator says, "Oh yeah, we're gonna make sure that veterans are taken care of. Thanks for your service. We're gonna take care of you." And taking care of means raising your disability percentage, expanding the definition of disability to where it's basically any veteran can do this. And then there's a collusive, this is a very particular kind of term, it's an excellent one, collusive lying that goes on between veterans and clinicians. And it's addressed a little bit in the book, quite a lot in the book, where the veteran knows that he's lying. The clinician who's treating him knows that he's lying. But the clinician doesn't want to call out the veteran because he's got 4 other appointments today and I don't want to get in a fight with this guy. And plus, if I question him, he's going to report me to either to my supervisor or to the licensing board. And the veteran knows that he's lying, but he's like, well, I'm just lying because all my buddies down at the veteran, at the VFW or whatever that I like to hang out with, all those guys are 100%. I should be too. And so I'm willing to go into the appointments and lie about it. And essentially, no surprise, there's cowardice up and down and across the veterans ecosystem. The politicians are doing things like this because they're afraid to stand up. The veterans are doing things like this because they're seeking gain. The treaters are doing things like this because they feel like, for a variety of reasons, actually. But essentially, there's a ton of sort of organic growth that's occurred in the system to make it the mess that it is now.
So you brought up something that I noticed in the book and some of the discussion, which is the environment of trust that is necessary for effective medical treatment is compromised by the system here. And it's something I've learned a ton about in the last few years working with physical therapists and occupational therapists and all these people who work in this space, is that the kind of the most important thing for patient outcomes with almost any condition is that individual's self-efficacy, their belief in their ability to recover, their belief in their ability to continue to do important things with their life. And I don't know if I have a question at the end of this or not, but it seems like we've built this scenario where the provider-patient relationship necessary to get to that is compromised by the fact that both people know the other is trying to respond to these weird financial incentives that surround the whole system, where the best outcome for the patient isn't necessarily the thing that the incentives are trying to push them towards.
Yeah, that's 100% true. So there's a guy that we cite a good bit in the book who is a guy named, he's a physical therapist, a doctor of physical therapy, named Scott Caro. And Scott tells this story. I mean, he tells all kinds of stories in the book where basically, if you're the physical therapist and you're trying to treat somebody for, let's say, a shoulder injury, and you're like, okay, you're doing rotations, whatever it is that's called for, but that their real, because they told you that their real goal is to use that shoulder injury to get to 100%. Well, that's the patient saying that they want to be as sick as possible, whereas your job as the clinician is to make them as better as possible and close the gap between where they were before and where they are now. That's what you're supposed to do. So undoubtedly, it causes providers, this reality of secondary gain causes providers to view their patients as something other than honorable. It makes the providers jaded because now they think that everybody who's coming through the door is only there for disability benefits and not to try to improve their station in life.
I'll hand this one to Drew in a second, but the one that stood out to me was, and it's from your book, there was an anecdote about how a veteran had been attending group therapy stuff for PTSD for a while and doing really well in group and making progress. And then the provider went back after all that and said, they've been really committed to this process. Let's make sure they get a bump in their disability to reward them for coming to all this treatment.
Right.
And it's wait, pause, hold on. So what you're saying is they've been really committed to the process and the treatment is really working. But so what we're going to record is that they are somehow more just that. What you're writing down.
Yeah, they're sicker.
That is failure. That is not the point.
Objectively.
Yeah. It's crazy the way. I mean, it's really, it's not just crazy. It's not just funny. It's immoral. Because there's a couple of things that happen here. One is people who are truly sick, people who are truly suffering, let's say with a mental health disorder, those people are not getting the treatment they deserve because clinicians are distracted by, they're distracted by the chaff and they can never get to the wheat. You want to separate the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats. And the clinicians are distracted by the chaff and they never get to the wheat. So they're not spending their time on people who are truly sick, but who are motivated to get better. They're spending their time on those people plus all these other people. So that's one way that it hurts that these people who are behaving this way hurt others is by diluting the amount of mental health. Mental health treatment. We all know, by the way, that there's a huge shortage of mental health providers in the country. And so if our mental health providers are overstressed and overstretched by how badly the system is structured, then it's no surprise that that's obviously very negative. Another way that it hurts veterans is by trapping them financially in an unimproved state. So if men especially get their identity from their work, and women can get their identity from their work. They can also get it from their family. They can also get it from other places, friends, let's say. But men primarily get their identity from their work, and there's tons of literature about this that I'll spare you the citations on. But what this system does is it de-incentivizes or disincentivizes work, because a lot of these veterans are afraid if they get a job, then they won't get a disability rating. And so it's this weird thing where it disincentivizes work, even though we know that work is powerfully protective against all kinds of negative ills. I mean, people who are working are physically healthier, mentally healthier, financially healthier, socially healthier, all of that stuff. And yet we've got this system that's designed, this in theory is supposed to make them to help them out in their life, but really it's trapping them in an unimproved condition. And so that's a real problem too. Is how the system disincentivizes positive behaviors.
You're setting up the perfect transition to the question that, for me at least, drove me to this book in the first place. And we discussed this a little bit before we started recording, but again, considering that most of the audience for our podcast deal with human performance in the military, which is for some folks relatively new, this idea that we will provide soldiers with dietitians, physical therapists. I would argue that maybe some of the warrior transition unit stuff fits into this too, that you mentioned in the book, but just giving them the tools that you would have in a collegiate space, a professional sport space, to become more lethal, to become more ready. However, and we see this, I mean, I see this occasionally in my day-to-day job where soldiers come in for treatment, for a bum knee or whatever. And the conversation sometimes turns to, what's this going to look like, down the road when I get out for my rating? And so I'd be curious to your thoughts on this competing system of, hey, we're going to invest a lot of time and money on the Army side to optimize the human weapon system. However, there's this other system that we're competing against that literally financially rewards you for being broken. And I'm just curious how you think that those could ever hope to co-harmoniously exist.
Yeah, I agree with you that they can't. I mean, I don't think they can harmoniously exist. I think it's kind of one or the other. Either you're trying to maximize human performance and make people's lives better, or you're trying to capture how bad off they are and then compensate them for it. But you can't have it both ways. But I'll extend your concern just a little bit, Drew. And this, we can talk about this as long as you want, because it's a huge problem. Is that the broken veteran narrative is a threat to national security too? Because if you think about 50% of post 9/11 veterans, last I saw is like 46%, but let's just round up to 50. Let's say all the VA's outreach to get people in the door and becoming disabled has worked, and now let's say it's 50%. So half of post 9/11 veterans are seeking disability benefits when they get out. So if you're the parent of a child, one of the things we know about recruiting and about propensity to serve is what it's called, you can measure propensity to serve among high school students, and then you can sort of figure out which ones are going to go to the military or not, which ones are amenable to potentially either doing a hitch or a career in the military. That's called propensity to serve. Well, what we know about propensity to serve is it's heavily influenced by parents, and parents are very alert to, like, what does this mean for my kid? And when they think the word veteran, what they're picturing in their mind is a disabled veteran license plate with a wheelchair symbol on it, or they're picturing, forgive the expression, they're picturing somebody like me who's actually a broken toy, a mangled guy getting around on crutches. Or if they saw all the stuff with Jon Stewart and the PACT Act, let's say, and they think if their kid goes in the military, they're going to be poisoned. Or they see that there's, a year or two ago, and I'm sure it's every military installation, but it was particularly bad at Fort Hood, which I think was renamed Fort Cavazos yesterday, the day before, which is kind of cool. Cavazos was a pretty serious hero. But anyway, so Fort Hood so there's all this stuff at Fort Hood where people where that one soldier, Vanessa Guthrie, I think her name was, or something like that, was kidnapped and raped and beaten to death in the desert. I think, I don't remember the exact details, but it was a horrible situation where this soldier was sexually assaulted. So if you as the parent are looking at your kid who's 16 and a couple of years from now they're going to be ready for military service or college or whatever, and you think they're going to be poisoned or raped or become amputees or burned or become mentally ill, then of course you're not going to want your kid to go to the Army. That's crazy. Then you're going to say to your kid, like, hey, son, let's take another look at maybe some other career for you. And so the broken veteran, all these veterans have managed to convince the world that they're disabled and they need maximum compensation, and they're making a big stink about it on TV and on billboards, the disabled American veterans billboards with the guy in a wheelchair, all that stuff. If that's what parents think is going to happen to their kid, then of course the propensity to serve is going to be very low. And so that's one reason why the Army missed its recruiting goals this year by like 50%, was because parents are like, hell no. The economy is healthy enough that my kid can probably get a job doing something else. Why would I want them to go in the military? They're going to get poisoned, raped, become mentally ill. That's crazy talk. So it's a serious problem.
I'm going to riff on this in a couple of different ways. One is I think about like how to have that conversation all the time, because I, for one, got way more from the Army than I ever like sacrificed for the Army. And I think that's probably true of a significant majority of veterans. And that's not a conversation that gets had very often. But when you talk about propensity to serve, I immediately think about the George Washington quote: "The willingness with which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive the veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by their nation." And I think that idea gets weaponized to say you have to give them these disability payments or else future generations won't serve because they don't think you took care of the veterans. And I think like that's a piece of it, right? The people who need the help should get the help. The people who bore the battle, to use the Lincoln quote, all of that. But there's like a narrative versus truth thing here. And the Vietnam anecdote you put in the group stood out to me because my parents are both from the Vietnam generation. And frankly, they both didn't really want me to join the military because of what they perceived in the Vietnam generation. And there's this idea that a lot of the people came back from Vietnam as like mentally ill, homeless, PTSD, like whatever it is, like all this stuff. And you cite some of it that like, in fact, like Vietnam veterans outperformed their civilian counterparts, like in business and in their careers and things like that. They did really well for themselves. And it's all about like the narrative that resonated with people versus the actual reality, which was like people learned some life lessons, people got some self-efficacy, people went on to do great things with their careers. So to go back to that Washington quote, part of how veterans should be taken care of is the disability system and stuff. But like part of it is just showing that like veterans can be successful members of society without a helping hand, and that they actually are like extremely capable people. And I think we miss that second half of it all the time.
Yeah, I would say yes, but I think that what we do owe veterans, and in the epilogue of the book is a chapter about sort of rethinking all of this and what ought we to do going forward. And I think, the VA, just for a second, the VA budget this year is like $310 billion, somewhere in that price range. And of that, over half is paid for disability benefits. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, $150 billion. That's a huge amount of money. And with $150 billion every year, what you could do is, when you have about 250,000 people exit military service, or 200,000 exit military service every year, what should we be doing? What could we do that's more productive with that, with some of that money? Well, we could for sure increase the ways that after service people can reskill, upskill, and transition in a more healthy way. We can for sure give job training, and maybe there's some things we can do with free or reduced cost education. There's some things we can do with job training, placement. All of that stuff is a positive way to help people's lives be better, instead of making their lives worse, which is what the disability system does. So it's not our willingness to spend that's the problem. We spend plenty of money. It's that we're spending it on stuff which is maladaptive rather than adaptive. And so we're not making people's lives better. We can make people's lives better not through disability benefits, except in some sort of pared down circumstances, I'll say. But we ought to be making their lives better with jobs. Jobs are the only thing that matters, really.
That brings up something I think about a lot when I have these discussions, because I've used like this platform that we have to discuss this issue before. I've cited your work on LinkedIn and pissed off tons of people and gotten in some fights. But what I routinely hear from people is that they would rather have the cash than the treatment, because they don't trust the VA to take care of them. And it's so backwards of like, we're not actually like fixing the root problem. And like, as you pointed out, more than half of the VA's budget goes to disability benefits, meaning that we're spending more on compensating for disability than we are on treatment, than we are on care, than we are on any of these programs. That just seems stunning to me, that instead of fixing the actual problem, we're just like kind of essentially paying people to not complain, sort of. Like, it's just,
wow, yeah.
I don't know. That's the most common refrain I hear from people, is that like, don't threaten my cash. I need that cash because the system that's supposed to fix me sucks.
That's really interesting, because the VA's health system actually gets really, really high ratings from most veterans. I mean, the healthcare that the VA gives is pretty high quality in most cases, and is free or low cost to the veteran. Now, it's expensive, the taxpayers are paying for it, but really the system is pretty good generally. But yeah, if that's the perception, that's obviously super negative.
I think that perception is widespread too. I see stuff all the time, at least in terms of like social media world, of like, oh, the VA is just awful. And I think that it comes back to narrative versus truth. But I hear from a bunch of people that like, I finally went and sought out care at the VA and it was actually really good. That's crazy. That's not what I heard.
Yeah.
People don't realize it's like one of the biggest, and like they're involved in tons of research stuff that no other medical system is involved in. And like the VA does some pretty great things if you give it a chance to do it.
Yeah, totally. I think that's definitely true. And also there's this world in which people are, especially on social media, people want to complain because it makes them feel special. And, there's this whole grievance culture, and, the grievance pyramid, and how discriminated against am I? And if I can get to the tip of the pyramid, then I'm the most discriminated against, and therefore everybody should love me, So if you're, so trans people are more discriminated against than gay people, and gay people are more discriminated against than hetero, and like on and on and on. And people are like seeking to be at the tip of the pyramid for some weird social science reason that I don't understand. And so I think part of the complaints that you hear are people just sort of saying that stuff because it's the cool kid thing to say, not because it's actually been their experience. But I'll just go one step further than you did, Alex, and just say that there is a possibility that some of the reason the disability system has grown so rapidly and so, I'd say, out of control, is because people who didn't ever serve feel guilty about not serving. And so they think that that is a way that's like paying all these veterans to be sick, paying all these veterans, whatever veteran wants they get is a way to assuage their own consciences for not ever having, picked up a rifle. And I don't think people should feel that way. I think if I've got a good buddy who is just a really good dude named Mark. And Mark lost an eye or lost vision in one eye, almost lost his life in a freak accident at a bonfire party when he was 16. Somebody put a bottle in there and the bottle blew up in a fire, and the bottle blew apart, shot a piece of shrapnel through his eye and through his throat and almost killed him. Anyways, so he can't serve. And he was getting ready to go to the Naval Academy and something, really sharp dude. But now he's the CEO of a company that is growing rapidly. He sold his part and got, he's rich, he's successful. They're doing important national security work. So he's serving more. He's probably had a more positive effect on national security than I did in my 25 years of uniform service, because I was just doing, whatever. I was just doing what I was supposed to do. But this guy is successful civilians are what's necessary for the military to be able to afford all the nice toys it has. So I don't think people should feel guilty at all for not serving. As a matter of fact, I think that our society, the way it fetishizes military service as if everybody who ever put on a uniform is a hero, I think is really destructive to sort of the social fabric, the unity and the social fabric. I was at an event yesterday where I had the same conversation. So the new medal recipient, his name is Paris Davis. If you remember that from a month and a half ago, he received his Medal of Honor for ridiculous heroics during the Vietnam War. Black Special Forces officer, retired as a colonel. I was hanging out with him yesterday, and he's elderly, late 70s, something like that. And so his daughter is the one, she drives him around, and she's the one, now that he's famous, all of a sudden, she's the one sort of managing his calendar and stuff like that. And she's really, really good. And I was talking to her, and she was like, I just have to say that everybody who ever put on a uniform is a hero. And blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, stop, time out. I was like, look, so this guy, he got a Medal of Honor for his ridiculous wartime heroics, but he also had a soldier's medal for ridiculous peacetime heroics. So this is a guy who had both the highest medal for non-combat valor and the highest medal for combat valor. And his daughter says that anybody who ever put on a uniform is a hero. And I'm like, stop. Your dad is a hero. A lot of the rest of us did our jobs, but people like your dad are heroes. And we use that word far too often because I think it's just a natural thing. People fetishize military service, and I think it's a problem.
Yeah, I've thought about that a bunch in terms of like there are programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and just like public school teachers and like all these things that deserve recognition that don't get it for some reason.
Yeah, how about cops? How about cops? Right? Like I spent about 5.5 months in Iraq, and so sometimes people are like, "Oh, how many tours did you do?" So and so did 12 tours. I'm like, I did half of one. I've got a good excuse. I've got a good excuse for quitting early, by the way. But nevertheless, what I would say, like, cops are heroes. Because not every cop, but cops can be heroes. Because look, if you serve 25 years as a cop, you're out there on the beat every day, pulling over people, whatever, and you don't know moment to moment whether you're about to be in a gunfight at any moment. And so that's like 25 years of deployment time, and I have 1 year of deployment time. Right now, the enemy's different, the threat level. There's no IEDs in America, et cetera. But let's use the word hero a little more sparingly than, oh yeah, just because you enlisted one day as a generator mechanic, now all of a sudden you're a hero.
I do want to clarify one thing because this came up in some spirited debate on LinkedIn, and I had some good conversations with people, and there were some examples of the VA failing people. They absolutely happen. And there is like both anecdotes and data to suggest that sometimes women veterans have issues with the VA that men don't always have. And I think that deserves to get addressed. I don't think that deserves to get addressed by just like slinging more cash and hoping the problem goes away. I think it deserves to get actually addressed. And there was one particular example. I won't name her. She seems awesome. She blocked me on LinkedIn because she decided that I was being egregiously disrespectful by questioning the veteran disability system. But she was wounded in action in Afghanistan and medevaced and went through all this stuff. And then when she went for her VA disability compensation stuff, whoever the claims adjuster person was said, "Oh, this is clearly a lie because women don't go to combat." Denied. And that was her reason that like the VA is bad. And my argument in that case would be like, well, first off, one, we shouldn't design a whole system around like one horrible incident. And second, people like her, going back to what you said earlier, Dan, like people who actually need these services, people who are severely wounded and go through things like this, deserve quality care. And the thing that gets in the way of it is a clogged system. So I would argue that like trying to clean up some of this stuff and trying to like make the system operate more efficiently is so that people in situations like her can get the care they deserve, not to deny them cash. It's just, it's very, I don't know. I understand why she was upset and like emotional about the whole thing because she went through a really bad personal experience, but it kind of feeds the discussion of the system failed you. And part of the reason the system failed you is because it's bogged down in all of this unhelpful, unproductive stuff.
Yeah, Alec, I think that there is a substantial possibility that this person was not telling the truth about what happened at the VA, because I find it to be stunningly unlikely that a VA person, as much effort as the VA has put into, outreach to women veterans and minority veterans, that somebody would literally say women don't ever go to combat when she had entered records, a documented Purple Heart and an evacuation from a combat theater. I think it's much more likely that person was simply not telling the truth about what experience she had. Now, why? I don't know, but I find that to be a very far-fetched example. But what I will say about women veterans is that the VA has been doing a much better job. They need to continue to improve that system, because there are cases, where people, especially older people who grew up in a different generation, don't think that women really serve in the same way as men do. And so, there's infinite stories about this, but I've had friends have this experience where women veterans pull up into let's say a reserved for combat veteran parking space at Walmart or something, if they happen to have one of those at that Walmart. And somebody will walk up to him and say, "Hey, that's reserved for combat veterans." And this is a woman who did serve in combat. And they're like, well, women also serve. So that does happen once in a while. But the idea that it happened in a VA claims type situation, I find to be probably, I'm throwing the BS flag on that person. But she blocked you anyway, so she'll never see this to prove one way or the other. But there are some things the VA needs to do better for women. Women's mental health needs are different than men's. Women's physical health needs obviously are different. There's a whole, the whole complex set of different kinds of systems that require different kinds of medical professionals, where the VA is sometimes understaffed. I mean, the VA doesn't deliver many babies. And so if somebody happens to be a, fertility age woman who needs to deliver a baby, it's hit and miss whether the VA is going to be the right place to do that. So there's some of that infrastructure the VA needs to continue to work on. But I think they're doing it. I know they're doing it, and it's just there's always room for improvement.
So one of the questions I want to ask, and as we get close to an hour, I kind of want to start looking towards like how do we? I mean, this is super broad, but like how do we fix the problem? And one of the anecdotes that seemed to come up a couple of times in your book is, various soldiers sort of told their stories, was like transitioning into the military is this total change in who you are. You're de-identified, you shave your head, same uniform, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you leave, you become kind of an N of one and you're sort of outcast. And then you become this veteran and you go into this. So my question is, Do you think, or do you have any thoughts or ideas on how the military itself, not necessarily the VA, but the military can do a better job of transitioning soldiers from, hey, you're active duty, you're part of this culture, to now, hey, you're a veteran. Let's walk through that process without you just losing everything about what you think it means to be who you are.
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and let's say you have 10-week basic training plus plus your advanced training, and so most even the simplest occupations in the military, let's say, have a 6-month timeline from when you join to when you're actually in a unit doing that work. Is there an argument for when people leave, putting them through reverse boot camp, helping them, de-identify as that warrior and now identify as some productive civilian thing? I like the concept, but I don't think I've seen a workable model for what that would look like. And is it mandatory? And can you opt out? And if I've got a job offer already, should I be able to opt out of a system like that? So I don't know how it would work in practice, but the idea is a really good one, which is, again, the identity has shifted from plow to sword, and we spent a lot of time heating that metal, beating it into a sword shape and sharpening it. How do you convert it back into a plow after you're done using it for sword type purposes? And that's a really, if somebody can crack the code on that, I think veterans will be better off. I have not seen a workable solution to that problem yet.
As someone who recently went through the transition program from active duty to, initially I was planning on being a civilian. I ended up not being able to fully give it up, and I'm in the reserve now. But going through it, it also involved a whole lot of like coaching on how to get benefits delivered at discharge and like what you need to do to navigate getting your bag of cash and stuff. So there's that whole thing too.
Yeah. So how do we make the system better? Well, a couple of things I think we ought to be doing. One is recognizing humans will seek ease and comfort over what's best for them if given the opportunity, right? Like we all will. Like all of us should have worked out today. Everybody listening to this podcast should have worked out today. What percentage of what percentage of you did? Because I certainly didn't. But what percentage of you did? I don't know. But people will often choose poorly, and so what you need to do is you need to create incentives for the behaviors that you want. So let's say if we know that the cost of which we do, we know that the cost of obesity is calculable, and you can calculate healthcare costs for an individual based on their BMI, and it's pretty accurate. So if the VA wants to have a lower burden of healthcare and a lower burden of disability, then maybe it could pay for behaviors at once. So when you go to your annual VA clinic update or whatever, your physical or something, if your BMI is within a normal range, awesome. We'll give you $1,500. I'll give you a check for $1,500 because your BMI is right. That would reduce healthcare costs. It would it would incentivize behaviors that we want rather than the behaviors that we don't. Secondly, I think what we need to do is we need to link, especially for mental health conditions, because they're improvable, I'll say, we need to link treatment and compensation. So if you're 100% rated for PTSD and you're not going to any appointments, well, it means one of two things is true. Either you're better and you don't need the treatments, or you're worse and somebody should really reach out to you, and we need to use whatever levers we can to get you back into treatment so that you can get better. And linking treatment to compensation would be a powerful way to do that. So if the person shows up for their appointment and they're participating with their clinician, the clinician types that in the encounter notes, and then the VA will cut the check at the end of the month for that person's residual disability level. And so linking treatment and compensation is something that could help reduce feigning, reduce faking, and also help get the sickest people the care that they need. So that would be something that we could do that's really powerful. And then the last thing I think that we must do is go through the disabilities, it's called the VASRD, the VA Schedule for Rating Disabilities. It's like a phone book of every disability and what it means and what its diagnostic criteria are and what its code is and what its rating is. We got to go through that with a fine-tooth comb and get rid of things that are aging related conditions. When you're 50, your knees hurt, more than they did when you were 20, not because of your military service, but because you're 50 and we live in a world with gravity, you know, parts wear out, stuff breaks. And so those are aging related conditions that are common to the human experience. And there's no reason the taxpayer should be on the hook for paying veterans for age related conditions. So get rid of age related conditions, get rid of genetic conditions out of there. You know, if you join the military and you come down with a genetic condition, we ought to treat you for it. We ought to get you into VA medical care or military treatment facility medical care. But what we shouldn't do is pretend that has anything to do with your service, because it does not. Right now, those are rated as service-connected conditions because they occurred during service. I think there's a way that we ought to be rethinking that. And then we ought to be looking at taking out minor conditions out of the system entirely. You know, if your ears are ringing, which that's going to really hack people off, because the number one rated condition in the disability system, the most common disability in the system is tinnitus, you know, ringing in the ears, for which there is no test. And so it's easy to just tell the doctor, oh yeah, doc, my ears are ringing terrible, and you get 10%, you know? So getting rid of those minor conditions and, you know, stop encouraging veterans to apply for every little silly thing that happens. I mean, things like alopecia, which is the condition when all your, actually alopecia might be the skin discoloration condition that Michael Jackson had,
Vitiligo.
Pigment. Oh, vitiligo. Yeah, vitiligo.
Yeah.
Is a VA disability, by the way. Vitiligo.
I remember you mentioned that in the book. It's like, what?
Yeah, it's crazy. The one alopecia is when all your hair falls out, and that's and it happens to men, kind of like in their early 40s or late 30s, and all of a sudden, like one day you wake up and your eyebrows and everything else is falling out. And I had a battalion commander who was super scary. His name was Norm Joseph, a really good dude, but he had that, and so he was this completely bald, like no hair on his arms, no eyebrows, no eyelashes. Is that a disability? Absolutely not. That's ridiculous to think of that as a disability. It's a condition, it's life, but it's not a disability. And so going through that in the VA system, it is, but it's not real. So going through the VA code of rating disabilities and getting rid of stuff that's minor and sort of, you know, conditions for which treatment is appropriate, but for which disability compensation is not, I think would be a pretty powerful step toward taking the fangs out of this dragon that Congress has created.
I know Drew has a follow-up, but I just want one little riff on that one, which is that, like, your book mentions sleep apnea, and I've looked up some of the sleep apnea stuff. My dad uses a CPAP because he has sleep apnea issues. And when I told him that it's like considered a disability for veterans, he just laughed. Like the CPAP is how he treats it, so it doesn't limit him, right? Like that's the whole
totally.
thing. Like that's and it's bonkers. And even I don't want to go down this rabbit hole because we don't have time on this episode. Maybe it's a conversation for another time. But watching the backlash during that like brief moment where the Congressional Budget Office floated the idea of means testing veterans disability payments based on income, and even like briefly comparing it to the means testing that's already in place for Social Security disability benefits, that's a dark, deep hole we could go down. But I know Drew wants to focus on like the more optimistic, how do we fix some of these things conversations. So I'll hand it back to him.
Well, no, I was only going to mention, because you kind of touched on this already, Dan, which is like, you know, for us at least, we have seen the emergence of this new Army Combat Fitness Test, and obviously they have different scores for different ages and all these things, and it got me thinking from where I sit. You know, is there a way that, and you touched on this, like you could financially reward people for being healthier, fitter later in their career and then transitioning out of their career? I mean, I don't know if that's a question so much, but like, do you even see in your work and in the kind of, you know, sphere of influence that you live in an appetite for that kind of thing? Because I don't frankly see a way that you can, I mean, you can have as many good ideas as you want, but how do you compete against being offered real money? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'll briefly throw out that a lot of civilian corporations, like big successful civilian companies, like
corporate wellness.
If you close the rings on your Apple Watch, you get X number of dollars off your medical insurance or whatever. Like there's precedent out there for this kind of stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I'm friends with the owner of Trek. His name is John Burke. Good dude. And he hired me years ago. He hired me to come do some leader development training at Trek. And if you're a Trek employee and you ride your bike to work, you get a discount on, what is it? There's some kind of extra payment or something if you ride your bike to work. And then they have this really great cafeteria in the Trek headquarters because there's no good restaurants close by because it's in Waterloo, Wisconsin. It's far away from everything. So they have a great cafeteria, but all the fast food is priced up, but salads and lean protein and stuff like that are really inexpensive. And it's just, those are like minor little touches that they think causes them to have reduced healthcare costs. And so they're willing to subsidize the price of a salad at their food bar for that reason. And similarly, I think there are minor little touches that we could do in veterans' lives that would help those veterans to seek a more healthy outcome without ever really knowing that they're seeking a healthier outcome because of the touches. So elegant public policy can turn behavior into the desired stream bed without causing undue disruption, but it has to be elegantly designed. The Apple Watch thing is really funny because I have a buddy who this is years ago, but basically same kind of thing. They had a step counter for some purpose, and he just put it on his dog and then played fetch with the dog for a while, and then he got his steps up by the dog doing steps. And so human behavior is dynamic and policy is static. And so any kind of system you'd have would have to take into account that people are always going to try to game the system.
Yeah. And honestly, I can't believe Drew's not like frothing at the mouth right now because he's usually all about the nutrition.
You mentioned
environment.
on-base food, the nutrition environment on military installations is the hill that I'm destined to die on, especially with this podcast.
And I've tried to have this conversation with a few leaders about some strategies for it. And I don't fully understand why AFUS has such a massive degree of control over nutrition on installations. This will be an episode that Drew and I do eventually, but like why there isn't a conversation about subsidizing healthy options on an installation. Like we say we care about service member health outcomes and we say they should eat healthier, and yet we just like abandon all responsibility for it and say that like fast food is more profitable and like AFUS it's not appropriated, so they have to make money, yada, yada, yada. All it would take is like appropriating a little bit of money to make it a little bit cheaper to buy healthy food, like whatever it is. That's a pretty small investment to get some really, really big results. I don't know. That's a whole other conversation, but.
Yeah. When I spent all that time at Walter Reed in the hospital, and the Walter Reed cafeteria, right? The place you should be the most healthy had these like expansive fried food options and like not much healthy food options. And we asked the hospital dietitian one time, like, hey, what is going on here? What is with this? And she goes, it's really simple. The people we have at the cafeteria are simply not going to eat healthy food. And so that's what we have. It's like, oh my gosh, dude, like, okay. But yeah, that's probably a conversation for another podcast. But I think there's a lot we can do. But first, I think the first step we have to do is recognize the problem. There's a lot of veterans out there coaching each other about how to be as sick as they can. And I think it's deeply dysfunctional. I think it's bad for society. It's bad for veterans. It's bad for the perception of veterans. It's bad for our national security. It's bad for our public finance. I mean, it's a horrible problem. And so somebody has to blow the whistle on it. And I'm glad that you guys have the courage to have somebody like me on, because you'll get hate. Who cares? Just, hate mail's not real. It doesn't matter.
We're looking forward to it.
Well, we want to get you out to the Potomac so you can fish before the sun goes down. So the last question that I will ask you mentioned obviously, the title of the book, and we'll give all the links to Amazon and all that. But for folks that are interested in your work, past and present, where's a good place to go? Where can they find some of the things you're working on? And if they're interested in this type of thing, like where would you direct them?
Really, most of the arguments that I have about this, there's a couple of different places. There's an article that I wrote, and you could look for my name and then this, and actually you could drop the link in. It's called A Better Way to Help Veterans. And then there's a sequel that I wrote a couple of years later that its working title was Still a Better Way to Help Veterans. I think that's what it was. But anyway, A Better Way to Help Veterans is that's free and easy to find, and that could unpack these arguments a bit. The book itself, I think, is probably best, and it's on Amazon and Audible and everything else. If you want a signed copy for some reason, you can get one at woundingwarriors.com. I'll send you a signed copy if you order one there. But I don't make much money on the book. It's Jeff Bezos on Amazon sales. I make like 30 cents a book, literally, which is not much because Jeff needs to pay for his fancy yachts and second wife and child support or whatever else he's got going on. But yeah, if you want to see the full argument, the book is probably the best way to do it. Oh, I was on another podcast actually that I was on. That's a really good one where I talk about the book explicitly. Is Andy Stump's podcast? If you know Andy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, former SEAL Team 6 operator, a really good dude, and his podcast is called Cleared Hot, and that was a 3-hour conversation about the same topics, and he did a good job, and I was really proud of my performance in his podcast. So that's a good one too.
Awesome. And we'll put all those in the show notes for folks that, are looking for it. I just want to say, having listened to your voice for, what was it, like 14 or so hours for the book? It was nice.
It was like 9. It was 9. Stop complaining.
No, I loved it. It was great. And honestly, from both of us, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, looking forward to some of the heat.
Oh, dude, send all that stuff to me. I don't mind. I'm happy to talk about all that stuff. And veterans are a powerful force in society and should be encouraged to continue in that way. And the system we have treats them poorly and they don't even know it.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.